Hello, hello. Welcome back to the second session. Last time we talked a little bit about some basic Python functionality in terms of variables, printing, and if checks. And we talked a little bit about interacting with Maya. We created cubes and moved objects around. And this time I want to dive a little bit more into Python lists and collections like tuples. And I want to talk a little bit about how you could use for loops to create scripts that work on multiple selected objects. Let me just get my notes and let's get into it. Right, so you might have seen from the last session, to reiterate, we'll always start with from Maya import cmds. And then now we're interacting with Maya. So we do cmds.ls selection equals true to get the current selection. I'll call that selected objects equals plural. And then I'm going to print this variable. And if I run that script, then we get this thing which looks like these square brackets and then a piece of text inside of it. Never mind that U in front of it. That is not very relevant. Sometimes these quoted strings will have a U or an R or something in front of it, but what we care about is that that is a piece of text, and I'll show you how Maya recognizes text. If you put it between quotes and makes it yellow, if you put that U in front, it will still work. So ignore the U. What's more important is these square brackets, and that is how you create a list. So I can say my list equals, and then run this piece of code and print it. And that all works, and this is now a list with one item inside of it, very similar to what we got from the selection. If we select two objects and we run this again, we'll get a comma and then a second value, and that is exactly how you write code with lists as well. So I can write, for example, x, y, z, and then I can print this, and then I have a list with 3 values. And like last time, we already used these square brackets to access values in the list. We always start counting from 0, very important. So we can print the 0th item in the list, and then the next one and the next one. So that is how you access information from this list. There's quite a lot of stuff we can do with lists, but I'll keep it a little bit minimal to start. We can grow lists by calling append. So you put the variable that is your list and a dot, and then the append function with brackets to call it, and then you put a value in there. So we can append the W, and then if we print our list again, it will have 4 values. Next, there is the pop function. And let's see, I want to show you 2 things at once. The pop function removes an item from the list, just like the square brackets will access one. So if I print my list 2 equals z, if I would pop the 2, it would remove the z from my list. But there's a special case where you can put a minus in front of a number, and then it's going to go from the right. So I have this list with 4 values, and with -1 I get the first value from the right. And that way I basically get back to my original list. So if I print it again, I'm back at this XYZ. And these are very useful functions where you can add and remove from a list. And especially this, where you can remove the last item, is very useful. It also works for accessing the last item. So if you want the last item in the list, you can also use the square brackets and the -1. And you can print that. You get, well, now that's the last item in this list is the Z again.
Maybe you can also show that if you do -2, then it takes the item just before that even.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I can go -2, and then we get, or I popped the Y right now. So now if I print my list, I only have X and Z. So it's the second from the right. And if I print the last item in the list is still the Z, But if I take the second one from the right, it will be X.
Also, in this case, you cannot use more items than your list has. So if you want to go my list -3, in this case, you're not able to.
I think so, indeed. That should give us an index error.
Yeah.
Yes. So this error means that you're getting data from a list that is not there. I'm trying to get the third item from the right, so that's like, but my list is only 2 items long. It's X and Z, so it's first, second, third doesn't exist, error. And the same goes the other way, so we start counting from 0. 1 would be Z, 2 would be index error, because that is too far into the list, that data does not exist. One final thing to mention, you will probably not see this very often, but a list can actually be any type of data mixed together. So I can put the number 5, I can put the text hello world, I can put that true in there. I can even put lists inside of lists, so I can put more data in there. So if I create this list and print, for example, my list 1, I will get that hello world text. I put a bracket too many. And if I take 3 or -1, I will get that list again. So this is a list inside of a list. And these things all stack. So I use these square brackets to access my list. But what that gives me is this list. So I can use another pair of square brackets to access something inside of that list. So I get the 0th item, and that is going to be 0, like you can see.
Maybe this would also be a good time to talk about type, to figure out what kind of type you're working with.
Right, yeah, I forgot about that. So that is a function called type, and you can put anything in there that you want. So I can put my variable myList in there, and then it's not going to print the data that is in my list, but it's going to print the fact that this is indeed a list. If I take the 0th item, I get integer. So this is a whole number that I put in that's called an int. The first item is going to be the hello world, and that is going to be a string or str. Another cool thing with all these types is that they are also functions that you have. So, for example, if I have the string 5, I can actually call the function int to convert this string 5 into the number 5 as an actual integer. Because, and I'll show you real quick, if I have x equals the string 5 and then I do x plus x, and I want to print that, I will get the 2 5s concatenated. And because when you combine 2 strings, you use plus to just add the pieces of text together. But if we want these to be numbers, then we'll do integer x. So we update x to be a real integer, and then we will print it, and then we'll do 5 plus 5 as numbers, and it will give us a 10. So when you see something like this happen, it can be very useful to print the type. What am I dealing with? Because if you just print the value, even if it's just the, I'm going to remove this, I'm just going to print the text 5, that looks like a 5. And you're not sure whether this is an int or a string. And then if you print the type of that x, you suddenly realize, like, oh, that's why it's doing this weird 55 thing. So when in doubt, or just in general, always print your values, print your types. It really helps you know what's going on, what's behind these variable names, what's behind these words.
It's the same with the string. Also from a string you can actually use it as a list. So you can actually get the character represented at a certain index. So
for example, you can do the 0th character in the string, and in hello world that's going to be the h, which will again just be a string. It's just going to be length 1. It's just going to be as if you typed this. And you can get the last character same way. So these things are very uniform, and the last data type I want to show you is called a tuple, and it is very similar to a list, but it uses round brackets. And the only reason I'm showing this to you is because we will encounter it sometimes, and it is, in every way, it's like a list, but you cannot modify it. So the tuple will have 3 values. I can print it. It will show the same data. I can print its type. And that will show that it's a tuple. But now if I, for example, and I can read from it before we move on. I can get the 0th or the -1 item, and I get that first value in the list. But now if I want to say my tuple.append 5, I get an error, and it's called an attribute error. Sometimes it's something else, I think. So, for example, if instead of reading the 0th element, I can also change the value there. I haven't shown that. I'll do a few more examples. So I try to change the first value of the tuple to the number 2, and then it gives me a type error. And both of these kind of mean that the tuple object is too inflexible to modify that data. Luckily, we can convert a tuple to a list very easily, like we've seen with the integer being converting a string to an integer. We can also use the list as a function to convert our tuple to an actual list. So I will use the list function to convert my tuple to a list, and then if I print that, you can already tell by the square brackets that this is now a list. And so if I go to convert it 0 equals 2, this will actually work without an error. And if I print the list again, it has changed the item at 0 to the number 2. And I can change it to anything again, because it can have mixed types of data. So now I have the text hello world at 0.0.
Only one type that you've now forgotten is the boolean. You've used it, but you haven't talked about it.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. So when we use functions in Maya like this, in Mel you often see ls selection, and this is just the Mel version where there's no data input. So when you have a cube, a polycube with a width, you tell the width is 10. But selection is more of like an on-off switch, and that's called a boolean. And in Python you put the equals and then true or false with a capital T or a capital F. And that is how you kind of set or unset this toggle. And we can also print the type of, for example, the word true. And then that is a bool. And the same works with if checks. So I mentioned before, you can basically take any piece of code and turn it into a variable. So if I want to say if 5 is larger than 4, print true, I can run this piece of code, 5 is larger than 4, so it is going to print the word true. I can take this and say my check equals 5 is larger than 4, and then I can say if my check. So you literally just swap out that piece of code with this this variable, and I can print that variable. So I can do this check, I can print, and it says, all right, your check is true. And now I can do this if, and it will still print true. And the useful thing there is that if you ever doubt if your code in an if check is correct or not, you can actually move that into a variable and print it so you can see what's going on. Is the if check actually happening? Is it doing what I expect it to do? So now I'd like to go back a little bit into Maya, and we can look at this selection, we can look at this list concept, and now I'm going to introduce a for loop concept where we do something for every object in the selection. So I'm going to go down here and just continue typing at the bottom. So selected objects equals cms.ls selection equals true. I run this code, I can print my selection, and that is two objects. And then there is this really nice thing in Python where you can say for space, and then you put a new variable name, and I'm going to call it selected object in, and then a list variable. So we have this list selected object, and I'm going to say for selected object in selected object. I think it kind of reads like what it's going to do. It's going to do a piece of code for every selected object, and it's going to name that variable. It's going to use this variable to contain the selected object. So I can put a print selected object. It's important to know that this was a plural and this is a singular. I like to keep it consistent like that. Some people use very different variable names. That's more up to your style. But if I run this code, it will print not once, but it will print twice because there were two objects in my list. So for every object, it will go once, do this print, and then it will go again twice, do this print with the other object. So we have access to the objects individually, and we can treat them one by one in this piece of code, which is also indented with 4 spaces.
To make it maybe even more interesting, on the next line print, and now we go on to the next object.
That's too long to write. So it finds the first cube in the list, then it goes to this next line of code, and we go on to the second object in the list, and then we go on to the next line of code. We are out of stuff in the list, so this is end of loop. I can even print that. Now it prints cube 1, we go on, cube 2, we go on, end of loop. So it keeps repeating this for as many objects as we have selected. I can select 4 objects and run this code. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4 with these additional pieces of code in between, and then end of loop.
It might also be interesting to show it that it is not on an alphabetical order, that it actually takes on the order of the list that you have selected or that you made.
Oh yeah, that's true. So in Maya, it remembers the order in which you click things. So I do 4, 2, 3, 1. If I do these 2 lines already, you can see it's 4, 2, 3, 1. And if I run all my code, it's going to keep that order alive. So it's going to go 4, 2, 3, 1. And that also works if you create your own list. So instead of selected objects, I can, for example, again say axes equals x, y, z. And then for axes and axes, print axes. It will print it in that order, but if I mess up the order or put some other data in there, it will always just go one by one in the order that I've specified these elements. So now that we know that, I think what we could do is write a little random rotation script, for example. So what I want to do is for every object, I want to set its rotate Y value to something random. This is going to introduce a new thing to import as well. So like we could import CMDS from Maya, we can also import random. And that is something that Python has built in. So it's not from Maya, it's just from Python. So it's just import random. And I'm moving this all the way up top because I want my imports to be at the top of the file. This is a cleanliness thing, and it's highly recommended to always import all the stuff first. So I run this, and now I have the random available, and I can say print random.random, I think, and this will give me a random value between 0 and 1.
So as you can see here, we imported the library called random, and the random library has a random function. If you want to go and look for more information, you can also find it on Google, because this is a Python function itself, or library itself. So there's more information there and more functions that you can make use of. Yeah, that's a good explanation. So there's a library, and you put the dot, and you access the content of the library, and in this case, that's the function is also called random, which is a little bit confusing. But before we've done, the library is called CMDS, and we put a dot, and we access the ls function inside the library. And the difference is that this is from Maya, so we go to the Maya documentation, but this is from Python, so you can go on Google and find the Python documentation, which is also, it's lengthy, so don't rely on it too much at the start, I think. It takes some getting used to being able to filter that much information and finding what you exactly need. So I can recommend, if you go on a web browser, to always just use Ctrl+F to look for keywords in the page that are in your mind. And if they're not on that page, maybe you should not be looking there, but find a simpler forum discussion, for example. That's also a thing to note. We're actually just working with Python at the moment. From Maya, the import that we do in the top, just make sure that we're working with Maya information. But we can also just do Python code in here that has nothing to do with Maya at all.
Yeah, very true. So this random value you can do outside of Maya as well if you were to write your own Python application. So I'm going to put that in a variable, and I'm going to print that again. And what I want to show you is that every time I run this function, it's going to change the value. So if I print the variable multiple times, it's going to be the same. But if I include that line that calls the random function, it is going to be a different value every time. And this is important when we're talking about for loops, for example. if we do this once and then do a for loop for every selected object, then the value doesn't update. But if we do this every loop, so we put the 4 spaces in front of this and we do it all the time, then it will actually be different for every object. And I'll actually show this where we can get the selected objects. I'm just going to write this from scratch, but it's going to be the same as before. Select objects equals cmds.ls selection equals true. And then for selected object in selected objects, well, I could, for example, already print the selected object so we can see what's going on. But I can also print the random value, and I'm going to say set the rotate y of this object to this random value. And I can run this code, and now every object would get the same value associated with it. But if I take this random value and instead put it inside the for loop, now it's going to change the value every loop. So I'm going to run it, and this selected object is not only going to print the selected object, but it's also going to run this line of code and then this line of code for every selected object. And we will get a new random value for every selected object. And that's exactly what we want. So we can do cmds.setAttr. And if you don't remember this, we did this last session. I recommend you watch it back and try and refresh your memory if you don't remember how to build a setAttr for a variable object name, because it's basically just adding the attribute name with a dot, but there's the variable name and then there's a piece of text that we have to add to it. And this is going to be rotate y and then comma random value, and that is a minute amount of rotation. So I think the main thing we want to do is just multiply this by 360, because there's 360 degrees in the circle. So if we just want to have full random circles, then we can run this code. And I should actually move these cubes a little bit further apart. And I'll select them again. And then as we run this code, all the cubes are going to do their own thing. They're just independently getting random rotations assigned to them. And I think that's all I wanted to go over for this session. You think there's anything I missed?
No, I think we mentioned all of it.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something.